Across the Sun by Jason Pagano and Bill Robinson. Chapter 6 Manifest Sight. Raven's Cross was a collection of stone and cement buildings nestled into the base of a mountain. People had maintained and inhabited these structures for countless generations. Some residents added layers of crushed, colored glass to exterior walls of their homes, reflecting sunlight for a resplendent welcome to travelers. Raven's Tack was a quirky old building that various proprietors had repurposed several times. Seedzy and her husband, Laird, currently ran the business. Its gritty walls were adorned with all sorts of equestrian tools and crafts. Gorham dismounted and began to unfasten his long coat as Aiden jumped from the cart to secure Skunk to a fence post. His tailwind spell had not yet subsided, but old Skunk was undoubtedly going to rest while he could.
Aiden, would you mind delivering to the grocer? I need to run one errand first, but I'll venture over there next,
Gorham said. His father was usually austere with him, but tamped down his critical tone when he needed something.
Guess I get to make bread twice today,
Aiden teased. He collected the crates of bread. Knowing something had rattled his father on the trail, he decided it would be better to pretend everything was fine. He felt bothered knowing he might not find out what the issue was, but he'd have that conversation with his siblings later. Clyde also grabbed a crate of bread. She liked staying close to her human brother in this mostly human town. Plus, helping with the bread was better than being stared at and scrutinized by everyone in Raven's Cross. She struggled to feel comfortable in her own fur when everyone around her thought she was some mutant animal. Underneath his open jacket, Gorham untied a length of fabric twisted like a large, braided ribbon, uncoiling it from around his body several times over. His family had assembled by the cart. They understood they could do what they wanted, provided they stayed out of trouble and returned to the cart when it was time to eat. His good children, he thought. He'd taught them self-defense, but would show them how to run away. Such a legacy to leave. Gorham entered the tax archway, Ricario following behind him. Their eyes adjusted to the shop's relatively dim interior. Beside pallets of feed and sundries, they saw Laird's wife behind the long counter, fussing with a large item.
Good morning, Seedzy,
Gorham said. The human made an odd humming sound. She was welcoming them, but she had 3 bent nails in her mouth as she held a large wooden post.
That's my sweet girl,
Gorham said to the child squatting on the floor by her mother.
Good day, Mr. Gorham,
Ulysses replied. Her arms were stretched out stirring something in a can, and her hands were blue.
Ulysses finished this piece the day after we last saw you. I helped her with the colors,
Seedzy said, reaching under the counter. She just removed several more nails from the post that had seen better days. Something seemed to be bothering her, but Gorham couldn't place it. The dwarf said.
You remember my son, Rook, yes?
Of course. How nice to see another family member. You're all growing up so fast. I was beginning to think Gorham didn't feel comfortable bringing any of you around.
It's good to see you again.
Ricario smiled. The exchange made him feel slightly uncomfortable.
Where are the others? Your children are all so different. I fear I might not even recognize them all. Are they home with Saba? I'd love to meet her someday, too.
The shopkeeper leaned against the counter to talk to Gorham, who wasn't paying attention.
How did it feel to fly like a bird?
Gorham asked the young girl encouragingly. Ricario didn't understand the non sequitur. He'd only been in the store a few times before, and only briefly. He didn't know what Gorham was asking.
I'm not sure,
Ulysses said.
but Dad was fun when he helped me pretend.
She stretched out her arms and began to lean from one side to the other. When she tilted too far, she left a blue handprint on the floor. Her mother frowned, but then she caught herself and took a deep breath.
The other day, Laird held her aloft while they were playing outside. I thought that was sweet.
She looked at Gorham.
I think asking my daughter to paint these images for you is paradoxical.
Stifling a sly grin, Gorham uncoiled his fabric bandolier on the counter. He untied some smaller threads at either end, opening them to reveal several pouches, each holding small gemstones, which reflected light beautifully atop the plush fabric. Gorham cleared his throat.
I apologize for sounding glib, but that's what I was hoping for. Call it abstract art, I suppose. A good challenge for the imagination never hurt anyone.
We sell supplies here.
Seedsy said.
At first, I thought you encouraging her to feel more involved was sweet, but I don't know why you would need more paintings. That isn't normal. She isn't...
Ulysses, I love the way you paint. The most important thing is that you enjoy doing it.
He said insincerely.
I can't wait to hang your painting up when we get home.
He'd interrupted before the shopkeeper could say her daughter wasn't normal. The girl reached for a wet towel and started rubbing her hands in it vigorously. The towel, already stained a reddish color, began to turn violet from the paint on her hands.
Do these paintings have anything to do with magic?
Her mother asked.
Seedsy, we're removed from most of civilization. Where else could I buy fine art for our home?
She stiffened.
Can't you heal her?
You mean with magic? No.
Gorham knew she was referring to her daughter's blindness. He collected his commission from the counter. The framed artwork on glass was roughly the size of a spellbook. Rukaru also understood she was asking about Arcana, and was surprised she'd speak so bluntly with her daughter right there. He said nothing.
I've heard about your magic. You call it something else. Something pretentious. I'm sure you teach it to all your foster children.
Seedsy said the word foster with condescension.
I teach my children many things, as a good parent does. We call it Arcana, which is the manifestation of energy beyond our physical and mental means. People call it magic because we can't explain how or why it works, that's all.
Seedsy stared at the dwarf. She didn't enjoy being challenged, especially by someone to whom she was literally talking down.
Arcana is integral to Elven culture, which celebrates its mysteries. Surely Laird has talked about it before.
Gorham felt sure Seedsy already knew what Arcana was. Feeling uncomfortable, Rukaru went to sit on the floor next to Ulysses, who was painting her palm and touching it to a canvas. He gently placed his palm against hers and watched her smile.
So you can't manifest sight to my child? Is that what you're saying?
Seedsy retorted.
Madam, there's a fine line between concern for your daughter and frustration over what she isn't.
Gorham normally chatted with Seedsy and Laird so cordially, and now he was feeling put off.
You can't do anything.
The human hissed.
I don't play God.
Gorham barked back, gasping at the last word. He clutched the artwork under his arm and looked at the floor.
She's happy.
Rukaru said from the corner. Although Ulysses wasn't crying, she looked upset. He turned to her.
Well, I know you're happy to see Gorham and me.
Ulysses was painfully shy, and Rukaru wished she spoke up more.
Seedsy, what happened?
Gorham asked sincerely.
You're not here to fix anything, remember?
A man hit Dad when we were in the garden yesterday. He sounded a lot bigger.
Ulysses said.
I can't discuss this now.
Seedsy was attempting to stay calm.
I am thankful you reached out to Ulysses. She loves painting for you. It means a lot to her.
Gorham thought to ask about Laird and any injuries he might have sustained, but also recognized she was dismissing him.
I think it's a beautiful work. Let's go, Rook.
The painting was still wrapped in fabric. Seedsy sighed and placed the gemstones in a small lockbox under the counter. Rukaru gave Ulysses a hug and stood, bowing his head to them both. The little girl put her paint supplies away, grabbed her towel, and scurried from the room.
I do love the paintings.
Gorham said.
Please give my regards to Laird. Be well, Seedsy.
The shopkeeper looked down at the post filled with holes and bent nails. She breathed in deeply and slowly, saying nothing. Once outside, Rukaru said,
You commissioned Ulysses to paint something for you?
He knew his father wouldn't discuss the unpleasant exchange that just transpired.
That's right. She's very special and has painted a few of these for me in the past. One of my spells uses these paintings as a component.
Are these paintings magical? I thought Seedsy just confirmed they don't practice. When we get home, can you show me what you're working on?
His son, fascinated by this new information, had dared to inquire about work happening in Gorham's study, which was off limits to the siblings. Gorham stiffened.
Do you suppose being blind means one cannot see?
I think I follow,
Rukaru said.
Vision isn't the only way to understand things. It can limit how grand your world can be.
Correct. Her mother wants me to cure her gift. I'd asked a child blind from birth to visualize what a bird sees as she flies over the world and commit that image to paint. She's never known sight as we have. It's like a paradox, yet it exists.
As they walked, Ricario asked.
Did you pay for this artwork in gemstones?
Gorham cleared his throat, implying he found so many questions nosy.
A dwarf always has extra gemstones lying around,
He answered with a grin.
Plus, in fabric, they don't make noise. You don't expect me to carry a coin purse or to leave valuables in the cart.
Ricario enjoyed being present whenever Gorham traded. He liked feeling helpful. Usually, the siblings would walk around or play or deliver their breads. He had never known why his father wore that bandolier into town. As they approached the grocer's pavilion, the sun played off mosaic panels of the earthen buildings. Ricario suspected his father had a soft spot for children and wanted to support the only child in town. He also assumed his siblings knew it was time to eat, and they'd manifest themselves at any moment. Chapter 7. Raven's Cross. Niwa had always felt comfortable with the idea of being lost. She secretly delighted in thinking she might be the first person to leave a footprint in a particular spot, and she longed to explore parts unknown. Raven's Cross was not parts unknown, but the hamlet seemed so remote. She guessed gnomes had never visited before. Just outside town were a few houses with glorious gardens and southern exposures. Having wandered over to these gardens, Niwa noticed a small footpath leading up the mountain slope. Intrigued, she ascended the path and gained access to someone's roof, where she decided to enjoy the sun's warmth. From this vantage, she observed a delightful mosaic of colored glass baked into the roof's edges. She squinted to see if she could conjure up images in the reflecting light. As she leaned back, a spirit appeared in the glass, startling her.
Liu Maki began traveling at a young age because there was a demand for her gardening skills.
The gnome spirit said.
She came to this village once to educate others on growing successful gardens.
You created these gardens?
In just a couple days, Niwa had become accustomed to speaking with her ancestors, who always discussed themselves in the third person. She suddenly looked around to see if anyone was watching her appearing to talk to herself. The spirit nodded.
She didn't feel safe here, despite the village's beauty, so she left shortly after the first breath of life came from the newly sown earth. The village was nonetheless suffering.
Niwa wasn't sure what she meant by suffering.
Did you learn something was happening to the crops?
Though her ancestor's image was faint in the bright sunlight, her ancestor had on gardening gloves and a lightweight wrap over her short braids. She suspected each spirit projected a likeness of herself in her prime.
Sometime later, she revisited the village.
The spirit continued.
That day of reunion, she saw a man beating a dog from across rows of vegetables. She chased the man away with a spade. As the scared young gardener left the village, the dog followed her, but she sadly commanded him to return home.
Her ancestors never showed emotion, but Niwa waited through a curiously long pause.
A soul in decay will first mistreat the smallest of creatures. Later, he will abuse his fellow man. Bravery is rare and precious. Could she stop this wayward soul?
You were strong.
Niwa said.
You could do it again.
Bravery is sometimes fleeting. Could a young girl stop a wayward soul again?
Her ancestor turned around. Niwa also looked in that direction. Eerily, when she turned back, her ancestor was gone. She was confused. Her ancestor, in repeating herself, had seemed to direct the question at Niwa. Just then, she heard a dog barking on the dirt road below. The barking was getting closer, followed by a horrible yelping sound. Niwa crawled slowly to the far side of the roof to investigate. 3 men had chased a dog towards the garden. The filthy dog was now scrambling desperately to get underneath the garden's wire fencing. Noticing some terracotta pots and a spade, she instantly knew some mysterious fortune had placed gardening implements on the roof. Below, the dog yelped again as the men, shouting obscenities, pulled her away from the fence. Niwa grabbed a pot and threw it at the closest human.
Leave that poor animal alone!
Niwa shouted as the pot shattered and the man collapsed with a thud. The other 2 looked up in surprise. The largest, An orc still hadn't let go of the dog. Niwa picked up the spade and leapt from the roof onto the orc's shoulders. With both hands, she held the spade tool under her opponent's throat and pulled back as hard as she could. Choking, the man released his grip on the dog, spun around, and threw Niwa to the ground. Fortunately, Aiden had heard the commotion. As he hurried to investigate, a dog ran past him. Then he saw his sister lying in the dirt as two men loomed over her.
You tried to kill me.
The orc moved toward Niwa menacingly. Fists clenched, Aiden ran to position himself between the two men and his sister.
So it's 2 against 1. I've never been one for a fair fight,
he said sarcastically. The human rushed forward with a wild haymaker. Aiden ducked the blow and drove his knee into the man's stomach, knocking the wind out of him as he fell in a heap.
Big mistake,
the orc said in a low growl, taking a step closer. It was all Aiden could do to dodge the punches and swipes. Fatigued, he couldn't find an opening in the orc's attacks. The few hits he'd sustained to his chest and head were now starting to hurt. Suddenly, sharp pain in the back of his head had him reeling. The ground rushed up to meet him. Through his blurry vision, Aiden saw the human he'd dismissed as unconscious holding the spade his sister had dropped in the struggle. He heard someone yell.
It's the rat! This punk is with the rat we saw earlier.
During the commotion, Clyde had also rushed to Niwa's aid and helped her up. She was clutching her sister's wrist. She knew they shouldn't be fighting, especially here in town.
Leave my sisters alone,
Aiden said, getting to his knees. The spade-wielding human looked incredulous.
That rat is your sister? I knew something was wrong with you four and that weird dwarf. This boy can't save his fat sister on his own. He needs the rat to do it for him.
Aiden rushed the orc and delivered a solid punch. The larger man grunted in shock as blood from his snout began dribbling into his slack mouth. Niwa didn't wish to be pulled away from the fight. Although one human lay clutching his abdomen, trying to catch his breath, she feared her injured brother couldn't fight two grown men. She searched her mind for any spell she could think to use. The human attempted to stab her brother with a garden spade, but he missed as Aiden ducked. Being attacked from both sides now, he wouldn't be so quick next time. Niwa stammered out some arcane words a spellcasting ancestor had described to her the night before, a spell called Snakebite, and hoped for the best. She dashed forward, hitting the man's flank. The spell soaked through clothes and skin like a rancid wastewater through an open wound. At first, the man didn't realize she'd smacked his side, but within seconds he became nauseated. With a sloppy kick, he slipped and landed on his back. The impact made him vomit and roll over while choking on it. Aiden tackled the orc, who fell backwards over the wire fence, landing on his neck and collapsing in a heap. With his head pounding and all opponents indisposed, Aiden jogged to catch up with his sisters, who were running back to the cart. Rokaryu and Gorham were nowhere to be seen. This made Niwa anxious, but also gave her time to come up with an explanation as to why she and her siblings were now filthy and possibly injured. Chapter 8. Self-Defense. In the late afternoon, Aiden woke up filthy and stiff in the back of the cart. Everything ached. He tried to sit up, which exacerbated his pain. He looked around, worried someone was watching him. He wasn't in any state to defend himself, let alone his sisters. He vaguely remembered falling asleep as soon as he and his sisters had returned to the cart. Rest felt like a luxury to the young human, who often struggled to find it. He was in his own backyard. Skunk was nearby in the paddock, absently staring at him. Aiden had never seen that mule spooked by anything. Gently, he placed one hand on his head and one on his chest and channeled his healing. The awful feeling of his viscera rubbing against his tender ribs began to subside. The gray fire of his healing hands had unraveled a knot of brambles in his guts. Aiden dismounted the cart slowly, only to jump upon seeing Rokaryu approaching him from the house. The elf offered him a red apple while munching on one of his own.
I know you'll tell me what really happened,
Aiden said, accepting the apple.
Do you remember a few trips ago the woman we saw selling beautiful corn outside of the grocer's pavilion?
Rokaryu had a habit of making simple anecdotes into elaborate narratives.
She said the multicolored corn was for decorative purposes or animal feed because it wasn't sweet like sweet corn.
Aiden took another bite of his apple and nodded. He had no idea what his brother was talking about.
Well, you and the others must have already been back at the cart when Gorm and I heard that same woman hollering. We were in the pavilion, which is where these apples came from, and, before you ask, Gorm took us home without a proper lunch, as you might imagine.
You know me, there will always be bread.
Aiden glanced towards the chimenea.
When we left the grocer, that woman was carrying a poor, filthy dog.
Ricario continued.
She was lugubrious, accusing someone of attacking her dog. By someone, I mean she didn't know who, but she knew something had happened.
The orc.
Aiden murmured, curious about a word his brother had used.
Yes, you would know who the culprit was, wouldn't you?
Ricario smiled slyly before biting into his apple.
Niwa must have said something.
Aiden cleared a lump in his throat. He believed punishment awaited him at the house, although his brother seemed too mellow for that to be true.
She didn't,
Ricario said.
In the commotion, the saddler and her daughter had stepped outside as well. Eulise said she could hear the distant voice of the man who'd beat up her father. Then an angry mob formed. It was wild.
Do you mean Laird's kid? I thought she didn't speak.
Aiden's eyes widened.
She doesn't speak much, but her timing couldn't have been better.
So the town went looking for those guys.
They didn't have to look very far. The dog had come running from the direction of the corn seller's house. There were 2 humans and an orc lying on the ground, and one was covered in his own vomit. You must have really messed them up,
Ricario suggested.
It wasn't exactly like that.
Aiden replied humbly.
I thought he was attacking Niwa. Actually, she'd taken one out by the time I got there.
Ricario looked surprised, then concerned.
No magic in town, right? Niwa made him vomit with a hit?
Oh.
Aiden considered this.
I really don't know for sure. I didn't see anything, Rook, honest.
You know Gorm would be livid,
the mage said. He went to hand the last of his apple to Skunk.
Who knows what he must be thinking?
Aiden sighed.
He thinks you defended the honor of a dog being abused by a few sociopaths, and our sisters made sure you didn't get too carried away.
Ricario glanced at his brother's exposed bruises.
That works.
Aiden felt relieved.
So, what did the mob do to those guys?
I don't know. We didn't stick around. Funny enough, it was Skunk here who expedited us out of town. Just as people were mobilizing, I had untethered him, but he didn't budge. Gorm walked over, and Skunk looked him right in the eyes. It was strange. He was emoting something heavy.
What do you mean, Rook?
In the light of the setting sun, Aiden also looked at Skunk, who was staring at him once again. Sometimes his old eyes really did show emotion.
I don't know if Gorm knew what it meant either. I swear I heard him mutter, "Not hobgoblins." Then to us he said, "Well, let's get the boy home so Saba can have a look at him." Then Skunk walked to the cart, and I hitched him up easily. We came straight home.
Ricario brushed the mule's neck.
Thank you.
Aiden hugged his brother, careful not to irritate his bruises.
I feared things were so much worse.
Saba was waiting out front for us as we arrived home,
Ricario said.
She walked right over to the cart to look you over. Gorm unhitched Skunk, but Saba told us to go inside for lunch. I thought that was curious since she should have assumed we ate lunch in town as we always do. Also, can you ever recall her awaiting our return?
Aiden had just healed himself, yet Saba had seen the condition he'd been in. Skunk gently nuzzled Aiden's back.
Saba understands what's going on, I suppose,
Ricario said.
I understand I need to eat,
Aiden replied. The brothers turned and walked home. Chapter 9. Written History. To see the world through another's perspective requires empathy. To see the world through another's eyes requires clairvoyance. When Saba focused on her ability, the world around her seemed to stand still. Observing others at a distance was very difficult to do if she was moving around. It was the reason she remained home so often while her family went about their days. Like most dwarves, she spent much of her life traveling, which gave her a great excuse, in her advanced age, to stay put. Skunk had always been an accommodating conduit for Saba's clairvoyance. While Gorm had settled down to a nap, she had settled into the study to find out from her children what really had happened that morning. She chuckled when she heard Ricario suggest to Aiden she already knew about their eventful day. Clyde heard her muffled laughter and peeked into the room the siblings called Gorham's study. She was surprised to see Saba alone, but with the door open, and she was comforted to see her mother in good spirits considering the morning they'd experienced.
Could you tell me how I'm different from an orc?
Clyde asked.
Of course.
Saba replied as calmly as she could, although the question startled her. Her youngest daughter always seemed so vulnerable on the rare occasions she vocalized her desire to better understand things.
Tell me about this orc you met today.
He doesn't live there. I saw him when we first arrived. He might have had some human blood in him, too. The townspeople had to look up to see him, and I knew they didn't like him.
Clyde was looking up and off into a corner, as though talking with someone much taller.
Orcs, unfortunately, carry a bad reputation. They are reluctantly allowed into society. Most people assume their orc blood makes them feral monsters. But many orcs have some other blood in them, maybe human or elfin, which makes finding inner peace even harder for them.
Saba was idly stretching her fingers and joints. Privately, she disapproved of Gorham training their daughter with uncanny image spells that always looked like vicious orcs.
He called me a rat.
He's ignorant,
The dwarf said simply.
and not just half of him.
The people of Ravenscross think I'm a rat.
That's also ignorance, which shouldn't be your problem. I wish it weren't.
Townspeople love to decide who doesn't belong.
Clyde squatted in the doorway and balanced on her heels.
The good news is, those townsfolk know Gorham very well, and they've watched you kids grow into fine young adults. They might think you're a rat, but they think you're a good rat.
Saba wasn't sure if her joke helped.
And they don't know you very well?
In truth, Clyde couldn't remember her mother ever joining them on an excursion into town.
I don't have much use for townspeople either.
Saba said. The Tikas closed her eyes, inhaling, then exhaling deeply. She felt childish for asking questions. Only little children asked their parents questions incessantly.
You asked me how you're different.
Saba was studying the discontent on her daughter's face.
For one, you make better life choices. Both you and an orc know what it's like to feel like you don't fit in. You could choose to take out your frustrations on people, but you don't. Life isn't going to be fair, but sometimes it is going to be kind. Wouldn't you rather be a part of it when that happens?
Yes, thank you. Good night.
Clyde lingered, which was the closest she could come to showing affection.
Sleep well, my brave one.
The dwarf watched her dash down the hallway. Surprisingly, Clyde went up to the dormitory via the sliding pole. Saba realized the stairs would have made creaking sounds, and her daughter had found a clever alternative. She was impressed. Saba began to sort through the pages of her writing scattered across the table. She decided to continue working on her major project. As she skimmed some passages, her mind began to wander.
Never have I seen our words so glorified. It's art.
Gorham had said quietly a month ago, leaning against her lovingly. He'd worked with Laird, the stabler from Ravenscross, to design something he'd called a portfolio. The durable leather binder had many pockets, allowing the archivist to make a proper book, the contents of which could be changed at any time. This had been a gift to his longtime companion, who felt motivated to prepare a dwarven history for her children. Dreamily, Saba documented her aphorisms, her maternal words of advice, her ancestral recipes. She also explained something the dwarves called the dwarven fortune, the reason their children had not encountered any other dwarves besides Gorham and her. The few dwarf communities that existed were all underground. Most dwarves would travel and explore different worlds. In some of the most uninhabited regions, these trailblazing dwarves would build homes for the ages, which would serve as respites for other travelers of their people. Saba and Gorham's current home had served many generations well before Ravenscross ever existed. Raising their children far from civilization meant they'd rarely seen anyone other than the handful of humans and elves who lived in Ravenscross. Their daughters had never seen another of their own kind before. But they'd chosen to live in this old dwarven hermitage on the subcontinent because, in another world, she'd seen the elves and humans and gnomes and others warring for generations. Their unique family could be a story of success. Saba, staring at the portfolio, considered what Clyde had asked her. Knowing her daughter understood social cues differently, Saba wrote about the dangers of stereotyping, that it often negatively affected Tikis and orcs. But not all orcs were pugnacious and doomed to a life of being feared or hated. And not all Tikis were chaotic and distrusting of larger folk. Everyone experienced life differently. She began to write about hobgoblins. If things had been different, their children would already know how to love and respect hobgoblins just as they loved each other. She reconsidered her words and crossed them out. Chapter 10. Guardianship.
If you're telling me it's time to start traveling again, I'd be receptive to that.
In the study, Gorham was holding up his newest painting, studying it.
We can't just keep running away.
I know Aiden didn't start that fight in town. He didn't plan on coming home, beaten and lying in the cot.
Saba knew Gorham had trouble facing fear and problems he couldn't solve. She wanted him to look her in the eyes.
I thought you said you didn't want to leave yet. You said this was the only home the children had ever known.
Gorham said.
Actually, this isn't about his fight. They're getting closer. It's difficult for me to say what will happen, but I know to trust my instincts.
Saba thought about their children playing at the pond. She imagined Clyde returning home unannounced at any moment and overhearing their conversation.
These people aren't after the children, Saba. They're after us. The altered path to Raven's Cross was by design.
Gorham placed the painting on a stack of papers, then sat in the only chair. Now he looked at Saba.
You have plenty of components to use now. Let's go back to the other world and stay there for a while,
Saba said.
Which one? It's hard enough getting Aiden interested in Arcana when he wants to know more about his own abilities. I don't think exposure to all those zealots will help matters.
I meant the last world. I doubt anyone's using the house now.
Saba sensed a hostile tone in Gorham she didn't appreciate. Gorham flapped his hands.
That's not a plan. Gus could still live there for all we know. I can't even imagine explaining this to him. We came back after all. Oh, these are your brothers and sisters, the ones we were able to raise to adulthood.
The joking belies your grief.
Saba narrowed her eyes at him.
You're right. It isn't helpful.
Gorham sighed.
Maybe leaving for a while would be best. We can think of it as traveling. The children are old enough for that.
This isn't traveling,
Saba said.
You are right. They're after you and me. I doubt they even know about the children.
No.
Gorham rubbed his forehead and began shaking.
Are you suggesting we go alone and they stay here? The children must come with us wherever we go next.
We'll never be ready, but we'll move forward anyway.
Saba held Gorham's hand.
We weren't ready to become parents, but our children are magnificent. I'm thankful for all the time we've had, and I believe we will find each other again.
I won't fight with you on this,
Gorham said.
I trust your instincts more than my own, but can't we fight for them?
I also believe fighting is what split the world up in the first place. I've watched you skillfully train in defense, not escalation.
Saba turned, hearing something. Without windows in the room to check, she waited, hearing nothing more.
3 copies of the same world, 3 lousy options after all. Feels like there's nowhere left to run.
Gorham stood, not letting go of Saba's hand.
A world turns, a dwarf moves. You can't love living if you fear living. I am no philosopher, but I don't think the dwarven fortune has changed our culture too much. I think we've instilled our values in our children well enough. I'm so thankful they have each other.
Saba glanced at the portfolio on the desk as she led Gorham out of the study. She had hidden some other documents in the messy room, which she would be adding to the portfolio very soon. On the next episode, after getting into a fight in town, Aiden finds humor to help calm his anxiety.
If you thought my bruises were bad, you should have seen the other guy.
The siblings figure the real trouble might come from their parents finding out, but Gorm and Saba aren't thinking about some thugs from Raven's Cross.
It's strange how little Saba and Gorm have discussed it with us.
Miss Saba knows everything.
Will someone follow them home and settle the score? Clyde seems to think so.
There were more of them in the woods.
Oh, good. I was afraid we didn't have anything to worry about.
Rikaryu, in his usual logic, tries to think it through.
I didn't see who was in the woods, but none of you ever saw them in town before, right? Should we assume a group of delinquents is roaming the area?
The answers to their questions are coming soon enough.
Something approaches.
Chapter 11, The Reverie. Next time on Across the Sun. Across the Sun, Episode 2 was voiced by Danielle Bouchard as Clyde, Julia Boudreau as Niwa, Julie Dalpy as Saba, Aaron Martin Colby as Gorham, Jason Pagano as Rikaryu, Bill Robinson as Aiden, Cindy Duarte as Sidzi, Samantha Opila as Ulysse, Paula Boudreau as Maki, Lucian Opila as Orc and Thug. Narrated by, edited, scored, mixed and mastered by Thomas Wells. Some sound effects and music acquired from Zapsplat.com.